Okay, good morning. It is Thursday, April 16th, and there we are. Thursday, April 16th, and we're talking about Franz Kafka this morning, and particularly we're talking about the judgment. So today you're going to read the judgment, and it's going to be amazing. So you've got a couple of options. One option is to listen to my little description here, and then um, read it with those insights kind of in mind. Or you could try reading it first and then trying to make sense of it on your own, and then coming back to this video and watching what I have to say about it. Either way, it's fine. I kind of prefer to make my own opinions about something before I look at someone else's ideas about it. So if I were you, I would read it first, think about it, try to come to some ideas about it, and then watch this video. But either way is fine. Okay, so the judgment is probably Kafka's most autobiographical story, and we know that because of the journals that we have of his. He wrote a lot in his journals about the experience of writing this story and also about his personal life, and we can see a lot of parallels there. So I will mention some of that as we go. The way the story goes is that about the first third of it is the main character, the narrator, George, is writing a letter to his friend who's in Russia. And his friend has apparently left Prague, where George lives, and is in Russia and is supportive of the Russian Revolution, and is kind of leading this adventurous bachelor single life that perhaps the narrator is a little bit jealous of. The narrator eventually reveals that he's writing his friend in order to tell him that he is engaged. And he's got some kind of guilt surrounding this. Like, he kind of feels bad about the fact that he's engaged and he hasn't told his friend about it yet. So he writes this letter, and you'll see that at the beginning of the story, it's very pretty and pastoral, right? It's like spring, it's morning, it's nice weather, it's, he's looking out his window, and it's a pretty little scene, and things are happy. And we go from this kind of pretty happy scene to slowly darkening throughout the story until at the end we get to this very dark scene. Okay, so the first third is him writing this letter and kind of thinking through like what he's trying to tell his friend in this letter. Then he goes to discuss with his father the fact that he wrote this letter. He wants to tell his father that he wrote his friend to tell his friend about his engagement. And as we know from yesterday's videos, father figures in Kafka are always rough. Let's just say that. So the father here is going to represent either some sort of guilt or authority figure that's overbearing, or judgment. And because we know that the title of this story is The Judgment, we can easily, even before reading the story, know that the father is going to be the judge. He's the one who's going to kind of sentence George to his kind of his penance for his sins. So George goes to talk to his father. Things seem pretty normal at first. The father is very elderly and sickly and stays in his room most of the time, and George has some guilt surrounding that, which we'll come into soon in the last third of the story. And at first the father says, you really don't actually have a friend in Russia. Like, you've made this guy up. And George doesn't really take him seriously, and he's like, he kind of dodges the question and changes the subject. And then at the end of the story, the last third, the father becomes the judge. And I don't want to give anything away for those of you who haven't read it yet, but the father switches the story completely and says, aha, I've caught you. I know more about your friend than you do. I've been in contact with him, and you are guilty, and I sentence you to punishment, and the punishment is extreme. And the really, really interesting thing about this story is that at that moment, it's kind of shocking what the father does, his sentence that he lays on the narrator. But then George accepts the punishment. He says, "Yes, you're right. I deserve that," and he goes and he carries out the sentence. So that's kind of the overall thrust of the story. Now, the key to understanding it is going to be to think of what Kafka valued and what he saw as his own sources of guilt. So, what you need to know about his personal life is that when he wrote this, he was actually engaged. And it's not a coincidence that the name of the woman he was engaged to was Felice Bauer. And the woman who George is engaged to in the story is Frida Bradenford. So it's, the same initials, FB. We can see the kind of connection there. So Kafka himself felt guilty about being engaged, not in relationship to some friend or to his father, but because he felt that he was selling himself out. And here's why. He believed that the ideal self for him was to be alone and to devote himself to his writing. And so to get married was kind of a selling out. It was taking the easy way out. It was doing the socially and romantically easy and expedient and enjoyable thing, but at the same time ruining his own devotion to his art. So, which brings me to Kafka's sense of who the ideal self is. For him, the ideal self is someone who is alone and completely devoted to their mission in life, and for him it was writing, but to their art or to their work, to their life's vocation. And so anything that would distract him from that, he felt was worthy of guilt. It was, again, it was selling out in a way. So if you think about it, we can see that the guilt that the character in the story has is very similar to the guilt that Kafka was feeling himself personally. The other source of guilt for the character in the story is his father, right? Like, we see that his father hasn't been well taken care of. He's got dirty underclothes, and he's basically stuck in his bed, and it's really dark and grimy in his room, and it's just kind of the sad situation. And so the guilt then stems from his engagement and from his treatment of his father. And so let's go back to the letter. So this letter that he's writing to his friend, that seems normal at first, but then in the end of the story seems kind of strange, because his father is talking about how at first it's not even a real person, and then later that like he has this special connection with him. If we think of that friend in Russia as being the representation of Kafka's ideal person, then in a way what we're seeing here is that the narrator, George, is feeling that he has been untrue to his ideal self, that this friend in Russia is representation of his ideal self, who he should be. He should be the kind of guy who goes to Russia and supports the revolution alone, forever a bachelor. But instead, he's the kind of guy who gets engaged and doesn't really devote himself to his work like he should. And so, rather than thinking of the friend in Russia, as a real person, at the end of the story, we can think of him as being the person George should be. And so when the father lays down the judgment on him, it's a judgment for not being who he should be, for not being true to himself, for not being his best version of himself. And that's why when the father lays down this judgment on him, he accepts it. He says, "You're right. I haven't been who I'm supposed to be. I should be like that friend, and I should be true to myself." And so he is so guilty over it that he accepts the punishment. And if you've read the story, you know that punishment is extreme. Okay, so that's my interpretation of the story. Now, It is the most straightforward and autobiographical story that we will read of Kafka's. That's why I wanted to start with it. And it seems so normal at the beginning, right? Like, pretty much the first two-thirds of the story, you're kind of like, well, this isn't so bad. It's just, it's a little strange, but it's not like so outlandish. Until basically the last page, it really turns into something strange. So, I hope that you got a good flavor for Kafka here in an easy way, and tomorrow we'll move on to a little bit more difficult one. Please hit me up with email questions or comments on Google Classroom or whatever you need if you want to talk more about the judgment. All right? Great. Have a good day.